Hi everyone, you have Laura Maureen from the Sterling Rice Group here, and I'm really excited to take you through some information about our honey consumer and just what they think about honey overall and why they buy it. So starting out, we have a brand new target audience to introduce to you, and that is the goodness seeker. And as you heard from Laurel and Keith earlier today, we shifted our strategy for the National Honey Board program to really be focused on these two pillars of good for me and good for the planet. And coming out of that, we determined that it would make sense to realign our target audience around those values and develop a new target audience that really resonated with those two key pillars. And that's exactly who the goodness seeker is. So who is the goodness seeker? We call her a she. She is female skewing, and she is millennial skewing. So when you kind of think about the goodness seeker, if you think about females that are millennials, that really gives you a good sense. She represents 17% of the US adults, and which is 42 million people. So what really is important to know about the goodness seeker is attitudinally what defines this person. And there's three key pillars. So as I mentioned, this person is really aligns with this pillar of good for me. They care about their health. They actively look for foods that are nutritious and are good for their health, and they care about their body and exercising. So health is very important to them. The second pillar that they really focus on is the planet and sustainability. And so this is, again, something that's very, very important to them. And when they're buying foods, they like to support products that are better for the environment, that help these different causes. And they look for foods that are unprocessed and natural and sustainable. And then last but not least, the third pillar here is this group is very food involved. They just enjoy trying new foods, shopping, around the grocery store, looking for new and different things, and really cooking and experimenting with food. So it's these three attitudinal pillars together that really define the goodness seeker and what drives them and motivates them. So as you can see, a lot of alignment with the strategy that we took you through earlier. So demographically, what that looks like is, as I mentioned, they skew millennial, more likely to be female than male, and their median age is about 46 years. You can also see that they have a higher than average household income, and they're more likely to work, work full or part-time. So it's a really, really powerful group of people that we're really excited to be focusing on. One of the greatest things about this audience of goodness seekers is that not only do they care about all of those things themselves around health, around sustainability and food, but they are a very powerful group of influencers. And by reaching this group, we're going to reach a much, much broader group of people because they have a strong voice with their friends and families. So for example, we see that 60% say that their friends or family ask for advice from them when it comes to food. Over half say that they're always the first of their friends to try new products or services. And 49% say they are likely to share their opinions online or post reviews. So again, it's a very influential group of people that have a lot of power beyond themselves. And by reaching them, we're going to be reaching a much larger group of people. On top of that, we see that they, from a shopping perspective, they shop a variety of chains, but really with this edge towards, upscale and progressive stores. They're often planning their shopping trips in advance, but they are making several trips a week. Now, some of this information is pre-COVID, but we still think that, where they're focusing their money and where they're doing their shopping has probably stayed pretty static. And then lastly, when you look at the goodness seeker from a media perspective, they spend a lot of time in digital and print media, but they still spend a lot of time watching TV. So just in general, this person is, very aware. They're always seeking information, always seeking inspiration, and they do spend a lot of time interacting with media because of that. So now that we know, a little bit about who this person is, the goodness seeker, let's dive into more about what do consumers think about honey. Now, this data that I'm going to be taking you through is from our most recent attitudes and usage study and focus groups that we did. And so it was 2 studies, as I mentioned. We had a quantitative study and a qualitative study. The quantitative study was done in June. So as we're going through this data, keep in mind that this is, post-COVID. So think about kind of where you were in your life in June, where COVID had set in for a couple of months. You were a little bit more normalcy had returned to life, but still vastly different than how it was pre-COVID. And so this was an online study conducted with US consumers. And most of the data we're going to be taking you through here is going to be focused on the general population. There will be a few places where we pull out the goodness seekers in general, but as you're looking at this data, just keep in mind that it is representative of the general population. So whether or not you and your company is going to be focusing on someone like the goodness seeker, this is just thinking about what do people in general think about honey. And there will be a few places where we pull out the goodness seekers specifically, and I will call that out. Next, we did do a qualitative study, and this was done in September of this year, so just a month ago. And this was with goodness seekers. So when we take you through this information, this will be specific to the goodness seeker target audience. So you can keep that in mind as you're going through. But it was great to add more texture and more depth into what we were seeing quantitatively through this qualitative study. So the first big question that we had is how top of mind is honey here? Hold on one second. Okay. So the biggest question we had here is how top of mind is honey when you think of sweeteners overall? And what we see is that sugar is by far the first thing that comes up when we ask people, when you think of a sweetener, what comes to mind? 58% of people say sugar. But then next on the list is honey, and that is 31%. So it's gaining on sugar and becoming something that's more and more top of mind when it comes to sweeteners overall. Now, when we ask this same question around spreads, what is the first spread that you think of when it comes top of mind? You see that honey is much, much lower on the list, down here at 5% in yellow. What does rise to the top are peanut and nut butters, followed by butter or margarine-based spreads, and then closely thereafter, jams and jellies. What's really interesting about this is where we're most often merchandised, is by spreads, but we're least likely to, we're much less top of mind, thought of as a spread as compared to a sweetener. Now, when we asked people about their health perceptions of honey, you'll see that they increased year over year. So we're seeing some really strong mentions around just overall health perceptions of honey. So if you look at this very far right column, it compares 2020 to 2019, and this is with the general population. Look at how many items we've seen strong increases on. So things like a good source of vitamins, gives you energy, low in calories, contains no added ingredients. So a lot of positives here when we're thinking about, really leaning into this good for me and this health halo, that we see that honey health perceptions just continue to increase year over year. Also, really positive news to report on is that we are seeing that negative stories in the media around sweeteners is on the decline. So fewer people are recalling negative stories about sweeteners and more people are recalling positive stories. So when we think back to 2019, there was a lot of negativity around sweeteners and people just avoiding sugars overall, and sugars kind of being the demon. If we fast forward to 2020, and remember this is June 2020 data, there's much less negativity about sweeteners being recalled in the news. So that's really on the decline. So that's really positive for us because there's just less information sort of beating people over the head about sugars and sweeteners being bad. Even more positive on top of that, when you look at this chart on the right, you can see that when the story is positive, which is the bar in yellow, you can see it's most likely to be about honey. And when it's negative, which is the bar in gray, it's least likely to be about honey. So we have the biggest gap there between, in a very positive way, between positive stories and negative stories. So there are fewer people recalling negative stories about sweeteners. And when the story is positive, they typically remember it being attributed to honey versus any of the other sweeteners. So again, really positive news for us that just the general media landscape around honey and what consumers are picking up on is much more positive than it has been in other years. So that's really, really great news for us. And we see when we look at self-reported consumption of honey that is increasing as well. So if you look at this first bar here that's noted for 2020, this is looking at heavy, medium, and light users of honey, and you can see there has been a 10-point increase from 2019 to 2020. So when we were declining from 2017 to 2018 and 2018 to 2019, all of a sudden we saw a huge reversal from 2019 to 2020, where we are now over where we were in 2017. So again, it appears that negativity towards sweeteners and declining usage of honey as a result is reversing, and that we're in a really positive place when it comes to self-reported consumption right now. The other chart on the right here is actually focusing on goodness seekers. So that is one area where I do want to point out that you can see goodness seekers are much more likely to be heavy honey users, with 41% classifying themselves as a heavy honey user. So again, just really great to see that this target audience that we're focusing on and really using as influencers are lovers of honey, and it's something that they turn to a lot in their daily diet. When we look at other sweeteners outside of honey, we see that overall sweetener usage is on the rise, and everyone from 2019 to 2020 really increasing in overall usage. This is included for white sugar, maple syrup, brown sugar, and even non-calorie sweeteners. So everyone's seen this reversal from years of consistently going down, declining, to now we're all of a sudden seeing an increase in usage. So a lot of that could be due to COVID and just people sort of changing their diets and changing the ways they're eating during COVID, and also to fewer negative stories. But overall, it's really positive to see this reversal in usage and it moving in a much more positive direction for not just honey, but all sweeteners. Now, when we look at spreads, we're seeing a really similar trend where most spread usage is up. Now, if we look at the top spread, which is butter or margarine, that actually had a small decline, but everything else we're seeing increases in usage. So again, positive to see that these categories that we're typically associated with of sweeteners and spreads, that just usage overall appears to be increasing. Now, this slide is probably one of the most exciting slides we had come out of this study. And so I do want to take a moment and just make sure that everyone really spend some time here to acknowledge that in 2020, for the first time since we've been tracking this study, honey surpassed white sugar as the most preferred sweetener overall. And again, this is the first time this has happened that we've surpassed white sugar. So it's really, really great news. So I mean, if you think about the fact that usage of honey is up, positive health perceptions of honey is up, and we are now the most preferred sweetener, surpassing white sugar, that's really great news. So consumers are loving honey, and it's something that they're really using more often. Now, this just looks historically back at the previous years, so you can see how this is tracked over time. But you can see that if you look back to 2017, white sugar really had a strong lead on honey. And over time, we've just really kind of closed that gap with them and now overtaken white sugar. So very positive momentum and trend we're seeing for preference of honey. So when we look at why do consumers choose honey over white sugar, you can see that everything here in green is a benefit that honey wins on over white sugar. So first of all, you can see that there's a lot of items there. So consumers overall are attributing a lot more things to honey than they are to white sugar. And then there's much fewer things, which the items on top in red are the areas where sugar beats out honey. So first of all, we see that honey really wins on things like contains no added ingredients, is unprocessed, is good for the environment, is natural and healthy. So those are some of the really key reasons that consumers are choosing honey over white sugar. Now, when you look at this top list here, where sugar beats out honey is on something you had on hand, convenient, a good value, and versatile. So a lot more functional reasons that sugar is winning on. I think these are areas we can really focus on when we're thinking about honey. How can we make it more convenient and easy to use? How can we continue to show and demonstrate that value of honey? And then on top of that, the versatility of honey. But overall, very strong delivery over white sugar in general. Now, when you look at this similar chart for maple syrup, the story is just a little bit different. And I think that you can gain a lot of learnings here about when you look at something that is viewed in maybe a more similar fashion between honey and maple syrup. So you can see everything on top in red is what maple syrup beats honey on. And things that rise to the top are comforting, flavorful, something everyone would enjoy. Now, when you look at where honey beats out maple syrup, you can see it beats out on natural, contains no added ingredients, and unprocessed. So honey is seen to be much more natural and unprocessed than maple syrup. And they're probably, when consumers are thinking of this, they're probably thinking beyond just, pure maple syrup and to some of the other options that are out there. You can see that maple syrup does win on some areas. So while we're closing the gap, there are areas we can still really win and beat out maple syrup on. Now, when we ask consumers, what are the most motivating reasons to eat even more honey, we see what rises to the top are really two key statements, either around honey consumption driving and helping with honeybee health. And then the second is around honey containing antioxidants. And then when you look down this list, you just see different variations of that. But when we're thinking about why will people eat more honey, it's because it's making that connection to honeybee health for them and making that strong connection for them, but also helping build that health halo and reminding them that honey does include things like antioxidants and the benefits of that. So let's dive a little bit further into these sustainability concerns, because as we saw, this is an important pillar for us in our new strategy that Laurel and Keith took you through. This is a very important thing when it comes to goodness seekers. And as we just saw in the most motivating statements, that connection of honey consumption to bee health is one of the most motivating reasons for them to eat more honey. So when we look at the awareness of the declining honeybee population, we can see that among the general population, that 72% of consumers are aware of that declining honeybee population. And that number has remained relatively flat over the last few years, hovering around, between 72 and 76%. So you can just consider about 3/4 of the people are aware that the honeybee health and are concerned about it. Where the numbers aren't quite so strong is the connection to honey and eating honey and if that is good or bad for the bees. So when we just ask consumers straight up, do you believe that using honey is good or bad for honeybees? We see that the majority of, about 50% say it's probably somewhat good or good, very good for bees. But then there's several people that don't really know either way. They say it's not good or bad for the honeybees. But then what's most interesting is this number at the very bottom, which is 27% say they don't know or aren't sure. So there's a big education gap we have to fill there to show that if you want to help honeybees, eating honey is actually a really, really positive thing you can do. And we need to build that education with consumers so that they don't, think that they're doing something bad, but that they actually know that they're helping support honeybees and all those concerns that they have there. So now that we know what they think about honey, we want to cover why are they buying honey? So first of all, let's just look overall, how are consumers really using honey? And we see that almost half are typically eating honey around the breakfast or morning occasion. So when you think about how they're using honey, think about all those breakfast occasions, whether it's in tea, whether it's in coffee, with toast, with oatmeal, with yogurt, in smoothies. But typically when honey is showing up, it's at that breakfast day part. That is, followed by lunch and then dinner with a little more usage there, probably in recipes. Now, when we're thinking about purchasing honey, we see that most consumers are planning their honey purchases, and that's 73%. So 3/4 are planning their honey purchases. And then when we asked, well, why are you planning it? Like, why is it showing up on your grocery list? The large majority are saying, it's just to restock. I was out of honey, I needed to replace it. So they always like to have honey on hand. And then the next largest percentage was 23% saying, there was a recipe that I had a specific use in mind for, and I needed to purchase honey for it. So when you're thinking about honey, it's definitely for the most part a planned purchase. Where are they purchasing their honey? We see that traditional grocery stores drive still the large majority of occasions, with 56% of honey purchases happening at just your traditional grocery store. After that, it's followed by a super center and then a natural food store. What's interesting to see is that we do see the number of people turning to traditional grocery stores for their honey is actually declining, where things like club stores like Sam's or Costco is actually on the rise. So while traditional grocery still dominates, fewer people, that number is declining and going down year over year. So then looking specifically at some of the last honey purchases. Sorry. Hold on, let me just get this figured out here. Okay. So looking at the last honey purchase, we can see that 88% of people purchased a liquid honey versus some other type of form, like a spread or a honeycomb or something like that. And then we can see the majority bought a national brand followed by a local brand. And then the key benefits they were seeking were claims on pack that said things like raw and unfiltered, locally made, organic. So those are the claims that were sort of jumping out and the things that they said were most important when they were choosing that specific honey that they purchased. Now, when we look at container size, almost 80% were buying a jar of honey that was, kind of classified as small or medium, so under 24 ounces. So people are more likely to buy those smaller jars of honey versus the much larger ones, which was only represented 21% of consumers. Then we asked about glass versus some type of plastic or squeeze bottle. We see that almost 70% were typically purchasing some type of plastic or squeeze bottle, while 31% were turning to more a glass bottle or a jar. As far as price goes, we see that half were purchasing a container that was less than $6, and then about a third were purchasing a container that was between $6 and $9, and then a much smaller portion spending more than $9 on a container. So for the most part, really focusing on those $6 or less containers. And then when we look at how many people bought them on sale versus on promotion or discounted, we see that 32% bought honey on sale. So the large majority purchased honey that was just at its original price and not on promotion. Okay, so that is all the findings we want to share with you as far as just consumers in general and the general population goes from our quantitative study. What we want to spend a little bit of time is adding some more richness and depth to that through our consumer focus group learnings that we had. Now, keep in mind, this is with goodness seekers. So those are the people that are more millennial focused. And remember, they care most about their health, foods and products that are good for the environment and good for sustainability, and they're very food involved. So this is focusing on that segment, but I think this does help add a lot of depth and richness to some of that quantitative data that we just saw. So let's take you through some highlights from those focus groups, which were conducted just a month ago. So again, very, very fresh, hot off the press learnings. So as I mentioned, this group cares a lot about the environment and sustainability. It is one of the driving factors of what defines them. But what we learned with this group is, they're just really taking small steps towards sustainability. They're doing things like eating more plant-based, they're recycling, they're looking for ways to save energy, whether it's through cars or things in their homes. And they're really trying to be smart and limiting their purchase of plastic and packaging overall. They're very attuned to packaging and waste. So here's, a couple of quotes we saw is, for example, we saw people saying, I switched to a hair care brand that focused on reducing their environmental impact, and they made recyclable bottles, so I don't feel so bad about some of the waste I'm producing myself. Another quote we saw is that I do a lot of research on what's good for the environment and which brands are committed to sustainability. And then I do switch and I make purchase decisions based on those brands. So this person said, I used to drink almond milk until I learned about the impact it had on the environment, and then I switched to oat milk. So these consumers are actively making changes in their lives towards sustainability, and they are making purchase decisions around sustainability and environmental impact. And as we saw in the data, we really saw reflected in our focus groups that while these consumers, they're very concerned about the health of bees and they really care about it, they don't know what the connection is between honey consumption and bee health. So when we asked them, do you think eating honey is good or bad for the bees? The most common response we saw was, you know what, I've never really thought about it. I've never really even made that connection. And then when we pushed them, they would say, well, it's probably good. I don't really see why it would be bad, but they weren't really sure. So again, there's a big knowledge gap there that if we could really demonstrate to consumers how eating honey is good for bees and helps promote positive bee health, that would be a very motivating thing to them because they really are concerned about bees and the overall environment. But when we talked to them about a lot of these environmental concerns, we did see that overall they will prioritize their health over the environment. So first and foremost, they're going to do what impacts them directly most, and then secondarily, they will consider the environment. So as we're thinking about the strategy we discussed earlier about honey being good for me and good for the planet, we have to make sure that good for me is really apparent and really coming forward, and that we're building on that health halo of honey, because that is first and foremost how they're going to make their food decisions, is how it impacts them and their own health. Now, as we saw in the data, we saw a reversal in trends around overall sweetener usage and sugar usage, where it felt that, people were not avoiding sugar and reducing their sugar consumption as much as they had in the past. And what we learned from our goodness seekers is while they do think that, sugar in general is bad and something to be avoided, primarily white sugar, that naturally occurring sugar is okay as long as it's in moderation. So we see that they're reading nutrition labels, they're avoiding products that are high in added sugars, But when it comes to things like you said, those naturally occurring sugars, like in fruit, that really that's okay for them, and that's fine. I mean, they'll still be careful about the amount they're consuming. It has to be in moderation, but naturally occurring sugars is really seen as okay from their point of view. And when we think about some of those naturally occurring sugars or sugar alternatives, like they're calling them, honey is a favorite. So we're really kind of put into a good category from that perspective. So honey was not associated with bad sugar. And they said, it was actually one of their favorite sugar alternatives because it's natural, because it's unprocessed, and because it has this perceived health halo and medicinal benefits. And, there's just a quote here saying that, maple syrup comes from a tree, honey comes from bees. So to me, they're not processed, they're natural. So they really are pulled apart from those more traditional sugars. Now, when we got a little more information from these consumers about where they're purchasing honey, we heard from them that when possible, they prefer to purchase honey from a farmer's market over the traditional grocery store. And the reason being is they feel that local is just seen as better for you. It's a feel-good purchase, and they like to support farmers markets, and they think that the honey they're getting there is higher quality. When we look at some of the claims that they're looking for, as we saw in the data, things like organic, local, and unprocessed are really what they're looking for. And so, they're looking for those claims that they think are convey higher quality and better for them. Now, we did hear some concern around honey purchased at the traditional grocery store potentially not being pure and potentially being adulterated. So there was some concern there that, if I have to buy my honey just at the regular grocery store, I'm concerned about the quality and I'm concerned about the purity of it. So that's why they have this preference for local and for farmers markets, because they believe it's more trustworthy, more pure, and they believe the credibility of it more. So taking all of those findings into account, for you and running your businesses, what can you do to really make sure you're appealing to the honey consumer in today's day and age? Obviously, things have been changing so rapidly in the landscape and in the environment. We want to just give you some parting thoughts on taking all of this data into account. What are the key things you can do to make sure that your product appeals to honey consumers? So we really built this into 3 key points. So how do you win with honey? So the first is just making sure that you're continually doing everything you can to separate honey from those traditional sugars. Even though trends are reversing from what we saw in the past, people are still avoiding sugar. They are still looking to alternatives and better for me options. And so we want to do everything we can to insulate and separate honey from that negativity and avoidance that's happening with traditional sugars and push honey into a separate area. And we're already living there. We just need to continue to push that and reinforce that. And how we can do it is by focusing on the health halo of honey and continuing to reinforce that. And then secondly, building on that education around the sustainability, the positive sustainability and environmental impact that honey has, and specifically helping to draw that connection between consuming honey and eating honey is actually really good for the bees and helps bee health. The second area of how to win with honey is really focusing on that unprocessed nature of honey compared to other sweeteners. As we saw one of our consumers say, honey just comes from bees. There's really no processing. It doesn't come from a manufacturing plant or facility. It comes from the bees. And so that unprocessed and really pure and sort of magical nature of honey really sets it apart from other sweeteners. And when we're thinking about other sweeteners here, we should be thinking about traditional sweeteners like white sugars, brown sugars, and maybe non-calorie sweeteners, but also these emerging sweeteners that consumers are turning to, because consumers are turning to things like monk fruit, like stevia, like coconut sugar, and they're believing that they're sort of unprocessed and healthier, but when it really comes down to it, it's not nearly as unprocessed as honey is. So the more we can lean into and demonstrate that unprocessed nature of honey, the more powerful it will be in really showcasing how honey is so different and why it is so valuable compared to so many of the other sweetener options. And then last but not least, when we're thinking about what consumers are looking for on pack, they're looking for cues that really convey quality. So these things like raw, unfiltered, and local. For most part, they don't really know what a lot of those terms mean. If you dig in, they really don't know what's behind that or what the difference is. But we do know is that these cues convey quality to them, and they are looking for things that are showing that it's going to be high quality honey, that's going to be good for them, and that is going to be good, and it's going to be a good purchase for the environment. So how can we bring forward those cues that convey raw, unfiltered, and local? And the more you can do that, the more you'll be appealing to those different honey buyers out there. So with that, I hope you guys found all of this information interesting and helpful, and we'll be able to open it up to Q&A right now to see if you guys have any questions for us. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Laurel. We do have a few questions coming in right now. If you have any questions, make sure to punch them in right now. First question is, what is driving the increase in brown sugar? Do you think it's baking at home?
Well, I think we can certainly look to that right now. We did not hear a lot of indications about brown sugar usage in our focus groups. So I think we know that, when you look at the more than 700% increase in yeast as an example, and so much that's happened during this pandemic with people cooking at home, I think we can absolutely see a linkage there. But it's something that we want to continue to dive into and continue to understand, because we're not seeing any natural connection, both through our groups or through the ANU overall.
Perfect. Couple other questions. On the motivating statements, especially the one about the concern for honeybees, were those given to consumers to rank, or did they just say that off the top of their head?
No, those messages, we have about 15 key messages that represent a lot of the parts of the program from across the entire National Honey Board program. And we utilize those in order to not be like that exact statement that we're going to use, but really to use those as a representative strategic approach and translate that from marketing knowledge to something that the consumer would understand. So those were messages that were given to them that are just trying to help us understand and be a proxy for where we can dig into in the future.
Perfect. And then one more. On the perceived medical benefits that some of the consumer focus groups said, did they give any indication of what those were?
Yeah, so we still continue to hear that linkage between cold and cough, and also just a true deep-seated belief that honey can help with different ailments, from allergies all the way up to some that we hadn't heard before. So it's interesting, I think the natural properties and some of these key linkages that have been kind of wives' tales that have been known in the past have really led, though, towards helping us to connect and separate honey from white sugar and other processed sweeteners. And we're seeing a real distinction that consumers are starting to make, whether it's agave and monk fruit and so many of these other sweeteners. That unprocessed nature of honey is playing out, and something that they're seeking for, because they definitely want less processed as much as they possibly can find.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for stepping in during the technical difficulties. We appreciate that.
Absolutely.